when we look at human genetics, the main thing that is going to be funded and studied are definitely going to be genetic diseases. And so we do want to just real quickly define what a disease is. It's actually any abnormal function. So based on how the human body or any organism's body should operate, if there's a variance from that, then that is considered a disease. So there are diseases that you can transmit or communicate to other humans, such as the flu. Here we're really looking at genetic diseases. And so we want to take a second and make sure what we really mean about gene or genetic. One definition is that it can be inherited. So it can be passed from parent to offspring, that you're born with it. But another more thorough definition is that one section of the DNA is not producing a functional protein. And so in the eye color study, case study, what we saw is that there could be lots of ways to get the same disease. Or in humans, we were looking really at the variation of blue eyes. But there could be lots of different ways to get cystic fibrosis. The main example...
Don't turn either.
The main example of cystic fibrosis, most of these are going to be based on one common mutation. So they can be inherited by similar gene mutations. So for example, in sickle cell anemia, there is one specific mutation that we'll see. This is meant to be similar mutations. But sometimes there's what's called a polymorphism. And that's where many shapes of the gene can happen. So maybe one person's changed from AAA to ATA. Maybe someone else has changed to ACA. So this polymorphic idea is that there are actually very many ways to get cystic fibrosis, PKU, Tay-Sachs. These are all genetic diseases in that there's just one gene. How the gene got wrong is kind of up for debate based on how it was really passed on through generations. What we see now when we look at the human population is this concept that there are certain common mutations that give these diseases that tend to have some things in common. So most people who have cystic fibrosis will have a specific mutation, and that's what they screen for, and we'll talk about it a little bit later. Cystic fibrosis is a hereditary disorder characterized by lung congestion and infection and malabsorption of nutrients by the pancreas. Basically what happens here is that there is overproduction of mucus and under what we call clearage. So mucus has a function in your body. It's meant to line your orifices, all the openings of your body, and that's supposed to help trap any invading things. So it could be a bacteria, virus, fungus, protists. It could be that it's trapping dust and pollen. It's supposed to keep it from getting in your body. And then your body is supposed to clear that mucus out. In cystic fibrosis, this is kind of a pleiotropic disease because we've got one gene that isn't working, and not only is there more mucus made, but it's not cleared out very well. And so cystic fibrosis, all three of these actually are autosomal recessive. And so when you read through the case study, you'll be looking at individuals who don't have the disease but are concerned they could pass it on to their children. And so this is actually a pedigree of cystic fibrosis. One of the things that we want to note, if they had only given us generations 1 and 2, that's not enough information. In generation 2, we have these parents that don't have the disease, and they have 2 children that do. And so what we should be able to do here is A, determine is it dominant or recessive. B, is it sex-linked or autosomal? We look for the daughter, she has it, dad doesn't, can't be sex-linked. So this pedigree is an autosomal recessive trait. And then we should be able to figure out the genotypes of all the individuals and actually be able to figure out the likelihood that they would pass on the trait as well. Another disease that I just want you to have heard of is PKU. This is where you can't break down the amino acid phenylalanine. You can just abbreviate phenyl for now. And when there's a lot of phenylalanine, you actually get brain damage. Now the unique thing about this particular genetic disease is that all I have to do is not eat this amino acid. So they have clearly identified what types of foods contain phenylalanine, and people who have PKU are just not supposed to consume that. So you can look on foods for labels, and it's actually required by law to list if it contains phenylalanine. A third one is actually Tay-Sachs. And Tay-Sachs is a brain degeneration. The interesting thing is that even though that they know that these are genetic, sometimes they have difficulty isolating which specific gene it is and what exactly went wrong with that gene. So keeping in mind everyone who has Tay-Sachs didn't get it the same way. So this is brain degeneration, and so that one of the main things we're going to see is a loss of muscle coordination. Coordination. But a really sad thing about this is that it usually impacts infants. And so it's going to be very young babies who have Tay-Sachs and actually die of Tay-Sachs. It is fatal. Now the thing about that is that means that they won't live to have children and pass it on. So you're going to see this a much lower prevalence because the people who have it can't pass it on. One of the things that they study is incidence and prevalence. So how many times does it happen and how frequent is it in a certain area? And so the last part is this concept of certain populations. We mentioned this in class. Because people are very likely to choose a mate within their ethnicity or within their culture group, a lot of times the gene pool is smaller. And so cystic fibrosis is found in Caucasian populations. PKU is found in certain populations like the Pennsylvania Dutch population. You don't have to memorize any of that as much as you need to know that because human mating habits usually are influenced by culture and ethnic groups, that we're going to see the incidence higher in some populations. The next disease that we're looking at is called Huntington's disease, and if you look at this pedigree, it almost looks like it skips a generation here. But if we actually look at who has it and who doesn't, here we have a mom who has it, her daughter and her son have it. A dad has it, his son has it. So if we were looking at this, first of all, don't let this mislead you. This is not saying that it skips a generation. These parents don't have it, but neither of their kids. Their daughter is just married to a man who has it. So this is actually, Huntington's disease is actually a dominant disease, and it is autosomal. And so one of the things that's interesting about Huntington's, besides the fact that it's dominant, is that it's very late onset. Usually there are no symptoms until about 40 years old. And what has usually happened by the time that you're 40 is you have usually already reproduced and possibly passed on that gene. So this is an interesting disease because a lot of people pass it on unknowingly, and they might have decided to not have kids. This disease is another brain degeneration disease. Of course, the brain is really interesting to study because you have some things like Huntington's, which are a clear single gene disease. You have others such as Alzheimer's that seem to have a genetic link, but it's not 100%. It's probably more like there are multiple genes and multiple pathways and the environment influences it. So Huntington's and Tay-Sachs are two where we're able to identify specific patterns that hold true. Others are going to be much more nature-nurture. So these are kind of the main ones that are uniquely 100% gene diseases. Another one that we need to talk about is sickle cell anemia. And this one is a little bit unique for a couple of reasons. The first reason is that it's actually a co-dominant gene. Meaning you can have some normal cells and some sickle cells in the same person. So this is a normal person's blood, and their blood cells are shaped kind of like these donuts. A sickled cell, we're talking about one amino acid wrong. What should be glutamine is here valine, and that changes the whole shape of the protein hemoglobin, and that changes the shape of the cell. If you are normal, you're completely normal. That's like this picture. If you are sickled, you're 100% sickled. But it is actually possible to be normal S, and then you're half and half. What this means is that you have half of your red blood cells are normal, the other half are sickle. These people don't really have as many symptoms. They have very few symptoms. Now, sickle cell anemia, if you have pure sickle cell, you're going to have a high incidence of blood clotting because those cells actually get stuck together, and this can be very painful. So sickle cell, people who have sickle cell anemia have a lot of blood clotting. They also have decreased oxygen provided, so they're not able to carry oxygen as well. The interesting thing about sickle cell anemia is that there's actually an advantage to being a heterozygote. And so what we're going to kind of end with talking about is a little bit further down. It's the concept that sometimes a gene stays in a population. It's not down there. Sometimes a gene stays in a population because there is an advantage. So if you are heterozygous, you're actually protected from malaria. Malaria is caused by a protus. We'll talk about this a little more later in the year. But that protus invades your red blood cells. And so if you are a heterozygote, the protus is not able to get in and not able to infect you. And so this actually means that in places where there are malaria, so where there's a high rate of malaria, there's a high rate of heterozygotes. These are the people who survive in malaria-stricken regions the best because they don't get malaria. People who are normal get malaria. People who are sickle, they don't get malaria, but they also don't survive well. And so you have a lot of heterozygotes. Heterozygote times heterozygote gives you a 25% chance of having an offspring with all sickled cells. So this is why we're actually going to see a high incidence of sickle cell anemia in places where there's malaria. And this is going to be in tropical areas it's carried by a specific mosquito that only lives in tropical areas, so not the mosquitoes, for example, here in North Carolina. So this is where we're going to stop.